Hi everyone! Welcome to Block Story Life. Here, we share the most fascinating and unexpected stories from Reddit. Subscribe so you don't miss out, and let's dive into the world of stories together. I faced discrimination my entire life because of my golden child sister, and she even tried to walk down the aisle at my wedding. Finally, I got my revenge. My parents always favored her, and it was far from subtle. If she accused me of something, they'd believe her and punish me. But if I accused her with undeniable proof, she'd get a lighter punishment, and they'd still find a reason to scold me. Even on my birthday, the cake always had to be her favorite flavor, and my parents pretended not to know that I hated it. They always bought her more than me and took us where she wanted, even if it was supposed to be about me. My sister grew up spoiled and used me as her punching bag. At first, she mostly ignored me, but things worsened in our teen years. She ended up with no friends, and her behavior went downhill. Did her friends move away or ditch her because she was mean? I don't know, because we were never close. My parents boasted about her achievements, but never acknowledged her flaws, while they constantly pointed out mine to use as teasing material. I only knew she had no friends because we went to the same school, and I noticed she no longer had anyone around her. Meanwhile, I was fairly popular, and my sister took notice, turning me from an occasional punching bag into a constant target. She began accusing me and my friends of various things, and my parents stopped letting me hang out with anyone. They would make excuses like, "Your sister thinks they're not good people," or "Why are you trying to leave us? Why can't you be like your sister and enjoy family time?" The only thing that saved me from complete isolation was my extended family. Many of them lived in the same town, and I got along well with my cousins, despite the age gaps. At one family gathering, they invited me somewhere, and I sadly admitted that I wasn't allowed to go anywhere because my parents wouldn't let me have friends since my sister didn't have any. This got back to the adults, who ended up confronting my parents about it. I was scolded later for lying and grounded for a month, but afterward, I was given a bit more freedom, so it was worth it. My sister then switched schools. I guess the humiliation of our extended family knowing about her lack of friends was too much. My parents immediately agreed, even though the new school was farther and more expensive. She made new friends there, but she didn't go back to mostly ignoring me, having felt the power to mess with me, and being angry that I told the family she had no friends. She never stopped making my life difficult. Her friends would come over and bully me, which my parents called light teasing. I never invited friends over because my parents were terrible hosts, or my sister would accuse them of stealing, and my parents would believe her. I became close to my cousins, though, as my parents never dared to treat family the same way. Later, I got my first boyfriend, and although I didn't want to bring him home, my parents insisted. At one point, we got separated, and he came to find me, saying my sister had been flirting with him, wearing skimpy clothing and batting her eyes at him. She began telling my boyfriend how terrible I was and how amazing she was in comparison. He was irritated and came to find me to explain what had happened. Predictably, my sister spun a different story to my parents, claiming that my boyfriend had flirted with her, but she had nobly refused because she couldn't do that to me. Guess who my parents believed? My boyfriend wasn't perfect, but I believed him immediately, though admittedly for a petty reason. I was a teenager dealing with constant unfair treatment, and my resentment towards my sister ran deep. I hated her just as much as she hated me. With that said, let's talk about appearances, which I haven't mentioned yet because they hadn't been relevant until now. My parents were overweight and expressed love through food, giving extra portions, buying treats, and so on. My sister was also overweight while I was not. I had always been on the skinny side, partly because punishment often involved withholding snacks or treats. Of course, weight doesn't define a person. Personality does. But even then, my sister was rude, spoiled, and entitled. Her flirting attempts were clumsy and forced because she never had to work for anything. She could just demand, and my parents would deliver. Added to that, she didn't exactly resemble a seductive model, so even my insecure teenage self doubted that my boyfriend would cheat on me with her. Despite this, my parents banned me from seeing him, labeling him a horrible boy. I tried to keep the relationship going in secret, but it was challenging, and it eventually ended. When I started dating someone new, my sister accused him of flirting with her as well. Once again, when he rejected her advances, she twisted the story, and my parents believed her. I pointed out the suspicious pattern, but they concluded that I had poor judgment and consistently chose bad boyfriends. This Romeo and Juliet style dynamic was too much for the relationship to bear, and it fizzled out. In high school, I gained a reputation for being a tease. I didn't mind kissing boys or being flirtatious, but I refused to commit to relationships. Thankfully, this reputation never reached my sister or parents. My sister, meanwhile, did bring one boyfriend home. My parents paraded him around like a prize, constantly telling me how wonderful he was, and criticizing me for not finding someone like him. But when he stopped coming around, my parents suddenly flipped their narrative, calling him a manipulative jerk who had deceived my sister. The favoritism continued. My sister always had more spending money and far looser curfews. She could go anywhere, anytime, while I wasn't allowed the same freedom. If I complained, my parents claimed it was because she was older. But when I reached the same age, I still didn't get those privileges. When I called them out, they denied ever saying it, or insisted it was because I couldn't be trusted, pointing to my sister's accusations about my boyfriends and friends as proof. Time passed, and my sister's high school graduation approached. She was accepted into a college, not a prestigious one, and didn't receive any scholarships. Because my parents only talked about her successes, I had no idea which colleges she had applied to, or how badly she'd been rejected. However, I knew her grades were poor, as my parents celebrated even when she got a B. Meanwhile, I consistently earned good grades, but my parents dismissed them, saying, "You always get those. What's there to celebrate?" Naturally, my parents made a big deal about her college plans, promising to pay for everything. I was relieved she'd be leaving, though it didn't bring much peace to my life. She came home every other weekend, and somehow, things always went missing from my room, or she created new ways to make my life difficult. Eventually, my mom came to talk to me about my upcoming graduation. I'm only a year younger than my sister, but she explained that since they were covering my sister's college expenses, they couldn't afford to pay for mine. She suggested it would be best if I started working right after graduation and waited until my sister finished university before seeing if they could help with my education. Oh, and if I chose to stay at home, I'd have to pay for all my personal expenses, contribute to the bills, and even pay rent. I pointed out that I could apply for student loans, to which my mom responded, "Yes, but no," claiming they were just looking out for me. She added that I had such poor judgment that they would decide if a college was worth going into debt for. I wasn't sure how they could stop me from taking out loans, but I didn't ask. Scholarships were never mentioned. They didn't even know what my grades were anymore and never believed in my potential anyway. I didn't bat an eyelid. I simply said, "Okay." My mom seemed taken aback, and she even started crying. Maybe she expected me to throw a tantrum so they'd have an excuse to never pay for my college. Instead, I calmly told her I understood their position, thanked her for caring, and left it at that. Later, my dad tried the same conversation, but I gave him the same unemotional response. By that point, I had zero expectations of them supporting my education. After years of their neglectful and biased parenting, I never once believed they'd eventually help pay for college if I worked and waited for my sister to graduate. I had been preparing for this moment for years. Since I rarely went out and had limited friendships, I spent most of my time studying. To me, college was my only chance to escape. When the time came, all that work paid off. I earned a scholarship, not to an Ivy League school or for something prestigious like law or medicine, but it was a good program at a decent college with a full scholarship. Knowing my sister would resent it and try to sabotage me through my parents, I strategically announced my achievement on social media. At the same time, I told my parents in person, even forcing myself to thank them in the post. Now they couldn't forbid me from going. Initially, my parents were proud, and even bragged a little about my scholarship. But soon, my sister must have gotten in their ears, because their attitudes shifted. They began asking if I was sure I wanted to go, warning me that my sister wasn't doing well in college. They claimed that since she was smarter and had better judgment than me, I would struggle even more. Of course, I stood my ground. They weren't happy, but there was nothing they could do. College was my salvation. For the first time, I started feeling happy. I still stayed in touch with my parents and visited during holidays, but since they refused to help with any expenses, I often used money as an excuse to avoid going. During this period, I avoided introducing them to any boyfriends. Meanwhile, my sister dropped out of college. I know she didn't graduate because my parents would have made a big fuss if she had. She moved back home, where she didn't pay rent or bills. But, as my parents explained, it's different. My mom helped her get a job at the same company she worked for, pulling strings to secure the position. This was presented to me as a point of pride in my sister's life. Around this time, I met my husband. He's the type of person who, when faced with an unfair situation, takes action instead of just saying, "If I were in that situation, I'd do something." I'm the opposite. I tend to freeze, let people walk all over me, and then stay up at night wishing I'd said or done something different. While I'm the type who cries when I'm angry, my husband is the type who claps back immediately. If he doesn't respond right away, it's because he's plotting something far worse. He's the kind of person who doesn't forgive or forget, unless it's truly resolved, and I love that about him. When we discussed marriage, we agreed we didn't care much about the ceremony. We were on a budget and preferred to put our money toward a dream honeymoon in Europe. For the wedding, we decided to hold it in my hometown since most of my family still lived there, and his family was more spread out. We weren't living far from my hometown, so we could take weekend trips to handle the planning. Plus, with some flexibility at work, we could stay in town longer if needed. We sent out our engagement announcement along with the save the date cards for a few months later. Naturally, my parents demanded to meet my fiancé. I wanted to stand my ground and refuse, but I struggled. The time and distance from them had softened me, and I started to wonder if they weren't as bad as I remembered. When I told my husband about their demand, he looked like I'd canceled Christmas. Still, I reassured him that I'd make sure they were never alone with him. But he had other ideas. He had been preparing for this moment. He had even bought a high-quality recorder to slip into his pocket, ready to capture anything that might happen. He was positively giddy, imagining all the ways he could shut down my sister's advances, insult her, and expose her to the family by sharing the recording. So, he went to meet them alone, excited for the chaos he might unleash. He returned home later, absolutely euphoric. "Babe, you won't believe the outrageous things they proposed. We can destroy them. The possibilities are endless." I was confused and asked to hear the recording, but he wisely told me to let him explain first so I wouldn't misunderstand. He recounted the meeting. Instead of my sister trying to flirt, my parents and sister had sat him down for a serious discussion. After a bit of grumbling about their doubts about me, my judgment, and their general disapproval of the relationship, they made an offer. They were willing to pay for our wedding, on one condition. My sister would get to walk down the aisle first. Yes, they wanted her to walk down my wedding aisle, dressed in a wedding gown, with photos taken of her and a cake to celebrate. Their excuse? It wasn't appropriate for a younger sister to marry before the older one, so this would give my sister a chance to experience the moment for herself. At this point, my husband wants to chime in.
Husband here. Hell hath no fury like a seasoned pro-revenge enthusiast when his beloved is insulted. As much as my wife, yep, she's my wife now, paints me as some quick-witted genius, I admit, my brain short-circuited when I heard their ridiculous proposal. It was like something out of a bad movie, a gift so absurd even the Trojans wouldn't have taken that horse again. Once I rebooted, I had a whole arsenal of insults ready to unleash. But then a little devil on my shoulder whispered, "String these fools along." So I told them I'd think about it, see how my fiancé might react, and then made a hasty exit before I could spill the beans about my plans.
Back to me. My husband recounted everything, grinning ear to ear, and even played the recording to prove it. I was stunned. The distance had made me forget just how awful they were, and I had never imagined they'd go this far. But my husband, staying focused on revenge, kept me from falling into despair. We had a blast brainstorming ways to ruin their plans. Some ideas were over-the-top ridiculous, while others seemed feasible. Eventually, we called his level-headed brother to get his input. He scolded us, admitting he couldn't convince us to avoid retaliation altogether, but warned us against anything too extreme, like giving them a fake venue address. He pointed out that some of our ideas could get us sued. After re-evaluating, we settled on the most benign yet satisfying plan. We'd act as if we agreed to their demands, only to hire security to ensure my sister couldn't get in. Of course, that wasn't the end of it. This was pro-revenge after all. My husband took the lead but made sure everything was run by me first. He went back to my parents, pretending to have thought it over. He told them he doubted I'd agree outright, but believed that if they surprised me with it during the wedding, I'd avoid causing a scene in front of everyone. He assured them he didn't want to see the family fall apart and would help them pull off their plan. On the other hand, marriage is a big deal, so who knew if I'd lash out when the moment came? My husband suggested a compromise to my parents. They would help pay for the wedding. This way, I'd feel even more pressure not to object, since not only would our families be present, but I'd also feel indebted to them for their financial contribution. He said my parents looked shocked, while my grown sister literally started skipping around with joy like a child. They accepted his suggestion without hesitation. Importantly, my husband framed the plan using their own words against them. He claimed I was distrustful and controlling, someone who liked to check his phone and invade his privacy to make sure he wasn't cheating. Therefore, he argued, nothing about this plan should ever be put in writing. Everything needed to be discussed in person at their house. I'm still so proud of how he used their narrative against them. And so began months of deception, where my parents and sister thought they were tricking me, while in reality, my husband and I were milking them for everything they were worth. Rather than paying for the wedding ourselves, we let them cover the costs. My parents, of course, wanted input on everything, including decisions that mattered to me, like the music and color palette. My husband would occasionally convince them to let it go to keep me in line, but since we didn't really care much about the ceremony, we let them think they were controlling the major details while plotting behind their backs. Here's what we did. When it came to food and drink options, we'd go to tastings and accept the lowest or second lowest priced option. Then my husband would secretly take my sister to try the same options. While there, he'd sigh and say, "It's such a pity we can't go for the best options since we don't want to take advantage of my fiancé's parents." Cue my sister demanding that my parents pay for the most expensive menu. My parents would then turn around and assure me that they'd cover the cost of the upgrades. We pulled the same trick with the photographer and the flowers. My husband handed my sister a bouquet of the flowers we actually wanted, and then regretfully expressed that I preferred a tasteless arrangement because I didn't want to burden my parents. My sister would insist on the better flowers, and my parents would agree to cover the costs. The wedding dress posed a minor challenge. My parents wanted me to wear a dress that, while not outright hideous, didn't suit my style or flatter me at all. We initially planned to agree and simply not use it. However, my mom sent a message about it, leaving a paper trail. Because of this, I had to stand my ground and refuse. My husband stepped in, promising to smooth things over. My sister, ever the schemer, suggested ruining my chosen dress, so I'd have no choice but to wear the one they picked. My husband pretended to agree with her plan to keep the ruse going. Throughout this time, all communication about the wedding was kept strictly verbal. My husband and I ensured that nothing about the plan was put in writing. My sister occasionally messaged my husband, but I always intercepted and replied myself. This reinforced the image my husband had painted of me as a controlling, neurotic fiancé, and they bought it completely. Some people might balk at the idea of their partner speaking poorly about them to family, but honestly, I found it hilarious. The idea of being portrayed as some controlling and manipulative person was so far from reality that it became a running joke between us. I even encouraged him to exaggerate it. I guess I have a twisted sense of humor. Oh, and yes, my sister did try to flirt with my husband. He played along just enough to keep them convinced he was on their side, acting conflicted about the situation. Of course, he never told them we'd hired security for the wedding. In the end, my husband and I, who had seriously considered a courthouse wedding to save money for our honeymoon, ended up with an extravagant, expensive ceremony that we barely paid a dime for. We jokingly called it reparations for emotional damages from my parents. I think my husband, okay, he just confirmed I'm right, was enjoying the whole deception far more than the actual wedding planning. I never thought I'd witness a guy so excited about wasting an entire Saturday on a long car trip to discuss wedding details with his in-laws, but there we were. Finally, the day arrived. The plan that my parents, sister, and husband had concocted was simple. They'd wait until everyone was seated for the ceremony. Since the bride traditionally comes out last, they'd have my sister arrive at the same time, ensuring I wouldn't see her and stop her. She'd walk down the aisle in her wedding dress, and by the time I found out, it would be too late to do anything. As for the dress drama, we had saved some leftover fabric from my alterations. My husband took it to my parents' house where my sister still lives and showed it to them as proof that he'd ruined my dress. He told them I was raging at home and that he needed to go back to calm me down. Then, he casually mentioned he'd see them at the wedding. To keep things under wraps, we initially only had a woman checking names at the venue entrance as guests, and my parents arrived. Once my parents had settled in, we brought out the actual security, a guy who looked every bit the part of a professional bodyguard. We instructed him not to let my sister enter under any circumstances and promised him a generous tip if he kept everything confidential. Soon, it was time. My parents received a text that my sister was less than 5 minutes away. My dad signaled for the ceremony to begin, as planned. My bridesmaids, who had been prepped to follow his lead without consulting me, took their places. My dad then stood at the entrance, waiting for me. Meanwhile, a friend who wasn't part of the wedding party texted me, telling me to get ready. This was to avoid suspicion, as my husband or bridesmaids texting me might have given something away. This friend, my husband's ally, was just as eager to stir up drama as he was and didn't mind staying behind the scenes. The moment arrived. As my dad took his position, the bridal march began. The doors opened, and I walked in. My dad was shocked to see me. He kept trying to look behind me, confused about why my sister wasn't there. From his vantage point, he couldn't see the venue entrance, so he had no idea what had happened. Then his phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. It was my sister. My dad mumbled something about something coming up and walked away, leaving me standing there. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. The friend in on the plan loudly asked, "What happened?" I feigned tears and said, "He told me it wasn't supposed to be me." My husband and I had agreed beforehand that if my dad abandoned me, I should say this to make him look as bad as possible. The tears weren't entirely fake. I was genuinely hurt and trying to keep it together. The friend then raised her voice asking, "What does he mean by that? Why shouldn't it be you?" Making sure everyone could hear. She ran off, pretending to check on the situation, but actually stirring up more chaos with security to ensure my dad couldn't return to interrupt the ceremony. Eventually, my mom left as well. At this point, my husband's dad quickly stepped in, running over to take my arm. He'd been warned ahead of time that he might need to step in. His earnest, hurried dash to me made me smile despite everything. I walked down the aisle to hushed whispers as the guests speculated about what was happening. Some left to check on the commotion, but by the time I reached my husband, everything was calm again. He comforted me, joking that my teary performance deserved an Oscar, and reassured me that he'd handle my parents later. The ceremony proceeded without further issues. My parents didn't return. During the reception, I noticed a lot of people leaving and coming back, but no one dared to tell me what was going on. At one point, someone whispered in my husband's ear, and he stepped out briefly. When he returned, his expression was thunderous. Leaning close, he told me he needed to hide before he broke character and started grinning. Later, I pieced together what had happened from friends, family, the security guard, and my husband. My sister arrived at the venue in a wedding dress, only to be stopped by security as we'd planned. He told her she must be at the wrong venue because there was already a bride inside. As agreed, we tipped him very generously. My dad tried to intimidate the security guard, threatening to call the police and claiming he had no idea who the guard was, so he couldn't possibly be working there. The security calmly agreed, saying he'd be happy to call the police since he was hired by us and was just doing his job. Realizing the delay would make it impossible to fix anything in time, my dad switched tactics and started demanding that the guard let my sister in. At that point, my friend, who was in on the plan, arrived, loudly shouting and berating my sister, asking what was going on and causing a scene to stall for time. Soon, my mom showed up, followed by others. By then, the entire plan had unraveled. All my parents could do was try to salvage their reputation as word spread, and horrified guests began piecing together what they'd tried to pull off. People started shouting at and berating my parents and sister. My parents, desperate, claimed it wasn't a secret plan and tried to pin the blame on my husband. When he was called over, he put on his best confused face, completely denying everything. To quote him later, gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. He acted outraged at the suggestion and demanded proof of their claims. Naturally, they had none. All the text messages they could show were about normal wedding decisions. Meanwhile, my sister threw a tantrum. She started screaming and crying, eventually sitting on the ground and kicking her legs like a child. My dad, furious, looked like he wanted to hit my husband, but security and other guests held him back. My parents then claimed the lack of proof was because my husband told them not to text about the plan. My husband laughed and said, "Wow, how convenient, huh?" Before repeating, "Why would I ever agree to something so messed up?" He then tore into them, calling them terrible parents, and declared he wasn't going to let their lies and schemes ruin his wedding. After that, he turned and walked back to me. No one believed their excuses. Although the venue had cameras, I wasn't allowed to see the footage since it was for security purposes only. However, several guests had recorded parts of the drama. Watching my parents and sister get torn apart by everyone who came out to see what was happening was one of the most satisfying wedding gifts I could have received. After years of being accused of things and not being believed, seeing them face the same treatment was an incredible feeling. My mother was in tears, my dad kept turning red and pale, and my sister continued to sob and scream on the floor. They kept insisting my husband was involved in the plan, but everyone questioned why he'd agree to something so ridiculous, why there was no proof, and why they thought it was acceptable for my sister to hijack my wedding. They had no real answers. Eventually, they were told to leave. My dad had to physically drag my sister up from the floor because she refused to move. Inside the venue, no one brought up the incident to me directly, likely wanting to spare me the drama. And perhaps because I was the bride, everyone made an extra effort to be positive, enthusiastic, and supportive. It was a refreshing change. My husband joked that the expensive food and drinks they were enjoying definitely helped keep the mood light. We had a fantastic time, and my husband kept his angry act up for only a short while before breaking into smiles again. After the reception, we went to our hotel to get some rest before heading off on our honeymoon. Speaking of the honeymoon, my parents had offered to pay for our plane tickets, but we refused, knowing it was risky. They could have easily canceled the tickets out of spite. Since then, all three of them, my parents and sister, have tried to contact me. My husband insisted we keep all communication documented, so I've refused to take their calls. This turned out to be a smart move, as my sister eventually messaged me directly. I won't repeat exactly what my sister said in her messages because they were unhinged and barely coherent, but the main points were that she blamed me for her humiliation, called my husband a two-faced snake who tricked them for months. He now jokes about printing and framing that quote, and confidently predicted that he'd cheat on me. She even suggested that he was already cheating on me, with her. My husband, unfazed, grabbed my phone, took screenshots of the call logs, my sister's messages, and several messages from my parents demanding I answer their calls. He then sent everything to our family group chat. He also included screenshots of messages they'd sent to him, full of insults and threats, keeping up his "I never agreed to anything" stance. He even hinted at suing them for defamation and harassment. In the group chat, he wrote a message pleading with my family to intervene, saying I was now being harassed nonstop by my parents and sister, even after they failed to ruin our wedding. He begged them to prevent further disruptions and protect our honeymoon. To drive the point home, he jokingly requested that no one share our location to avoid my parents sending my sister to our honeymoon suite and claiming he had agreed to pretend to sleep with her. Yes, really. He even added LOL at the end. Our family assured us they'd handle it, and since then, things have been peaceful. My husband is a little disappointed that my sister hasn't tried to escalate the situation. He was looking forward to calling her out again and tearing her argument apart. But for now, we'll see how long the peace lasts. All in all, while I would have preferred a loving and supportive family at my wedding, at least for once in my life, they not only failed to ruin something meaningful to me, but I also got my revenge. Extra information. Do I know why they treat me like this? People have asked me this question repeatedly, and I assume you're wondering the same. I've spent my entire life trying to understand, but I still don't know. When I was younger, I tried asking, but they denied treating me differently and scolded me for being spoiled, so I stopped asking. Over the years, I've considered many possibilities, but my best guess is this: I was unplanned. My parents took a long time to have my sister, so she was not only wanted but also considered a miracle child after such a long wait. Given the small age gap between us, I suspect they weren't expecting to have another child so soon. Maybe they didn't use proper protection or didn't realize my mom was pregnant until it was too late. Either way, they ended up with an unplanned baby while still dealing with a newborn. Since they weren't well off, the extra expense probably didn't help and they resented me for it. Of course, this is just my theory. Regardless, I've accepted that the reason doesn't matter. What they did to me was unwarranted, no matter the circumstances. Did they really think this would work? My husband and I have a theory about that. We don't believe they genuinely intended to go through with their plan. Instead, we think my sister threw a tantrum over me getting married first, especially since she barely dates. To placate her, they made that outlandish proposition to my husband. Their goal wasn't to pay for my wedding, but to suggest something so ridiculous that we'd refuse. That way they could look like the good parents to my sister while having an excuse not to spend a dime on me. But when my husband accepted their terms, they were backed into a corner. They couldn't retract their offer without risking my sister's wrath, so they had no choice but to go along with it. What do you think about all this? Thank you for watching. I am waiting for your assessment of this story in the comments, as well as ask you to put a like, put a bell, and subscribe to the channel. Till new exciting stories together. Block Story Life.